Something you might be interested in is to have responses collected on Qualtrics be imported back into Qualtrics. This can be useful in cases where you want other survey respondents to rate the responses or answer questions about the responses originally collected. Or alternatively, you simply have a large bank of questions that you want to import into Qualtrics. The usual way that you would go about creating survey questions is to write these using the Qualtrics website. But what this means is that if you have several hundred or even thousands of questions, you have to copy and paste each of these into Qualtrics manually, which can take hours. It's made even more difficult by the fact that Qualtrics has difficulty handling particularly large numbers of questions. So by the time that you get to your 1000th question, it can be taking up to a minute to even add one more. But luckily, Qualtrics provides an alternative way to import surveys, which is via a text file. The way that it works is that you create a text file which is formatted in a way that Qualtrics can read. This includes instructions such as the type of question, for example, multiple choice, how you want the blocks to be formatted, response options, how many questions per block, and of course the actual content of the questions. So because of this, we can use R to quickly create a text file that we can easily import into Qualtrics, allowing us to bypass the need to add questions manually. So first we create a template on Qualtrics which allows us to get an idea of how we want to structure the survey and what we want it to look like. Once we have this, we create a dummy text version of the template, adding all the instructions Qualtrics will need to know in order to create the survey from the text file. Then we download our responses from Qualtrics and import them into R, format our responses in R and include the instructions that Qualtrics will need to know in order to import our survey. And then we export the resulting output as a text file and import that into Qualtrics. So to demonstrate, I'll start with a basic example. Say you've gotten a bunch of people to write some beautiful prose, and now you want other people to rate their poetry and provide some feedback. So here is the original survey that respondents saw, and it includes questions such as name, years of poetry experience, actually writing some poetry, and then rating their own poetry. So the first step is to create a template on Qualtrics of how you will want your final survey to look. So obviously this won't include the thousands of questions that you'll end up including in the end, but it will include an example question so that you know how you want to format your text file. So what we have here is just a very basic, we have 3 blocks. The first one is your instructions. The second one is an example of the rating. So this will be where the responses from the previous survey will go, the responses on the actual poem. These will be questions that the new survey respondents will have to answer. For example, your initial thoughts and how you rate it. And then you have the final block, which is thanking you for your participation. So a debrief. So obviously this is only one question. So in this section on poetry ratings, that's where your thousands of responses will go. But this is just an example. So the next step is to create a text file that includes all the instructions that when you import them into Qualtrics, that it will result in essentially this format. So Qualtrics has a whole list of instructions that essentially when you include them in the text file, they tell Qualtrics what sort of questions you want and you provide other information. And so they've got this whole list on their website here under preparing an advanced format text file, or I've got a PDF version, which I'll link as well. So I've pre-prepared a text file here, which includes the instructions that we'll need in order to create this survey. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to provide an instruction at the very start, which says that you want an advanced format, which allows you to do more complex sorts of questions. And then you specify the blocks. So we're saying this is the first block and we want it to be called instructions because that's what it's called here. And then within this block called instructions, we want a question and we want a text question. So we don't want any responses, we just want a block of text. So the question is called text. And remember, the whole list of questions that are available can be found on their website or as a PDF. And so then you need to actually include the content of the question. And so here we said we want a heading called instructions. We want this to be bold, which is just HTML formatting. So if you want to add extra formatting to your text file and to your survey, you can do that. You just need to specify HTML code. And so you can find basic HTML code instructions online, such as things like adding italics, adding bold. This is an important one, breaks. So that adds breaks in between your paragraphs, because if you don't do this, then the whole paragraph will come out on the same line with no spacing. So the paragraph of text will come out on the same line as this instructions heading. And so then we actually have the content below here. And then there's only one question in this block. So then we want to say we want a new block. We want this block to be called poetry ratings, which is what it's called here. We want and we want to start with a question, and we want it to be a text question. So we want we don't want participants to have to respond. We just want to show the poem. And so another thing that's important to include is that you can also include an ID. And so we want all the questions relating to one particular poem to have the same ID, and we separate them using A, B, C, and D, like here. So this is poem number 1, A, poem number 1, B, and C. And that's important because that will allow us at the end, after people have actually responded to this, to link these responses back to the poem that they're related to. So here we have a poem, and then we say, and we haven't added the poem content here, but that's what will go there eventually. So that's all for question 1. And then question 2 is a text entry, which is that we want participants to write something. And again, we add in our ID, but this time at ending it with a letter B. And then we have our question, which is what are your initial thoughts? And then it knows that it's a text entry, so it will provide a text box like this. The last question here is, and this is a little bit trickier. So here we want a question, we want a multiple choice question, MC question. We want a single answer, so we don't want participants to be able to select more than one option. And we want these values to come up horizontally rather than vertically. And then you, again, you add the ID. How do you rate this poetry is the question. And then here, because it's a multiple choice question, you have to add in what the options are. And so we've added all the options here. And then we have one more block, which is your debrief. And so that has one text question. We just call the ID debrief. And then we just add our content of our debrief. So that's the text file. And so then what you want to do is, before you even get into R and start playing around and trying to put this all together, you want to have a go at seeing if you can import this into Qualtrics and making sure that it all works. So the way that you can import a text file into Qualtrics is that you go to Tools, then you click Import, Import Survey, choose your text file, which you've pre-formatted. Select the text file you're after, and then import that. And when we do that, it'll come up with a default question block, which you can delete. It's just a question block which doesn't contain anything, but all the rest, we can remove this. But all the rest of the survey should look exactly like what you had specified. It's looking pretty good. So now that we know that our text file definitely works, now we can jump into R and see if we can apply this to all our thousands of questions so that we can import it automatically rather than having to add them manually. All right, so we'll start with loading our relevant libraries and importing our data. And so this data is our poetry responses from our original survey, and we can have a quick look at them to see what they look like. And when we do that, we can see variables such as the variables that Qualtrics provides, as well as our actual answers, such as our poetry and people's ratings of their own poetry, their names and their years of experience. The other thing that you might notice straight away is that we've got these 2 extra rows that aren't actually questions. They're just things that Qualtrics provides, and so we'll have to get rid of them. So if we go back into our script, we can, another way to view our poetry data set is to run glimpse. And when we do that, we can see all our variables here as well. It's just an alternative way that makes it easier to see what your variable names are, what variables you're dealing with. So most of this information is information that Qualtrics will give you and is not necessarily relevant, but maybe for your purposes. But the ones that we're specifically interested in today is their actual poetry. The other thing we're interested in is their response ID, because that we can use that as a unique identifier. So we can link our ratings that we're getting from this survey back to the original poet. So what we need to do then is we need to remove the first two rows, and we can do that using a function called slice, which will remove the first two rows here, these two here. We need to select only our response ID, which is our unique identifier, as well as the actual poems. And then the other thing you might notice is we'll need to filter out any poems that weren't completed. So here we've got one missing value, which is someone who didn't actually write a poem. And so we have to remove this. So when we do that and we look at poetry again, here all we're left with is our response ID on Qualtrics, our unique identifier, as well as the actual poetry. Right, so that's the first part done. Now we need to add the instructions from the text file that we've created to our script. And we need to kind of weave that in between the actual responses. So we're adding them in blocks, and you'll see why we add them in blocks in a moment. But remember, all we're doing is we're taking sections of this text here, and we're adding that as variables into R. So when, for example, we run this, block 1, then we can see that block 1 simply includes the very start of this document here, all the way up to poetry ratings. We're going to do the same for block 3, which is our debrief. That's this one here. And then we'll add a few more sections, and I'll explain why in a second. So we have before poem 1, which is this part here. Before poem 2, which is this part, all the way up to here. After poem, which is this section here. After poem 3, which is this section here, etc. And so we'll just have to run these. All right, so now what we have is we have our data set, which contains their unique IDs and their actual responses. And we've got these blocks of text, which will essentially need to wrap around this information. So what we want to do is for each one of these, we want to start with, a question that is text entry. Then afterwards, we want to add their response ID. Then we want to provide some more information for the Qualtrics file. Then we want to actually add their responses. And then we want to finish it off with a wrapper at the end saying this is the end of the question. So what we're doing here is we are creating a new object, which we'll also call poetry. So we're essentially overriding our original poetry object. And we're creating a new column called formatted, where we essentially add all this information together. So we add in, oh, I think I've forgotten a few. One sec, I need to run these two. So we're adding some information before the actual poem. Then we have to add in their response ID. Then we have to add in some more information. Then we add the actual response, their actual poetry. And then we add some more information. And remember, the reason that we're repeating this response ID is because we've got 3 questions. And for each of those 3 questions, we want to add their actual ID value in here. That's why response ID comes up 3 times. And so when we run that, and we look at our value again, we now have this new column called formatted, and when you extract part of just the formatted part, then what you can see is, for example, we've got poem 1, which contains this information at the start, then some information about their ID, then the actual poem, then some more, then another question, the ID, what are your initial thoughts about the poem, and see, you can see here that this information matches, but without the spaces, the actual questions in here. And so the last part that we need to do now is, so we've added these values here, we just haven't added block 1 and block 3. And so the final part of this is that we essentially concatenate all this information together. So we create one object, which we call formatted, which consists of block 1, which is this information that this information just about the first block, then the actual formatted column of the poetry data set, and then a final block, which we call block 3. And when we do that, and we run that, and we view that, then we have one huge block of text, which, as I stated, starts with the first block, then contains all the individual responses, and then finishes with a block, which is the debrief. All right, so essentially what we've done now is we've created a kind of text formatted file, which we can export as a text file and then easily import into Qualtrics. So the final part here is to actually export this text file. So we're writing write.table just tells it to write a text file. The object that we want to write is formatted, which is this one that we've created here. The output file is called formatted.txt, and then we've got some information to stop it from doing things that we don't want it to do. So when we run that and we have a look at our files, we've now ended up with a file called formatted.txt, and that's what's going to go into Qualtrics. All right, so I've just opened the text file that we've just exported from R just to see what it looks like, and it's all looking beautiful. So what we've got here is we've got this intro block at the start with some instructions. Then we start with our poetry ratings, and what we can see is that all the poems are coming up beautifully. And so the other thing to note here is that the IDs, the response IDs, or the unique identifiers, are coming up quite well. And so these, as well as the suffix at the end, which tells you what question number it is. So this is question 1, which is the actual poem, question 2 or question B, which is the first question, that text entry question, and then question C, which is the multiple choice question. And so that's poem 1. Then we've got another poem here, and another poem here, and another poem here. So that's looking really good. And so then, and in the end, we have our debrief here, which is, it's all looking as we want it to. So let's see if we can actually import that into Qualtrics and see if it's being formatted properly. All right, so again, the way that we're going to import this text file is via Tools, Import Export, then Import Survey. Select the formatted.txt file that we created earlier. And import that. Again, we have to remove this initial block here. And then what we can see is that these are coming up here. The one thing that I've noticed straight away here is that you need to make sure that if you want your responses to be formatted in a particular way, again, you need to include these breaks. So in your initial responses, in R, you might need to add a bit of information, HTML code, to indicate that these are separate sentences. So that's just at the end of each sentence saying break, start a new line. For the rest is coming up well. We've got one block with instructions here. we've got a block of poetry ratings here. We've got the IDs, which are coming up well. And look, we've got each of the poems coming up well. Beautiful. The one thing that you might want to do is, if you don't want participants to see all of this in one go, you can add a page break, and there is an option in import and export surveys to add a page break in as well, in here. And so you'll need to specify that at the end of each question. So every third question, add a page break. So all that would require is, in R, you would go back here and you would add, for example, just up here or something, you would add a page break as an instruction. And so that's coming up well here, and then we've got our final block. So that's it. That's how it works.